Imagine this. You are a young senator's son named Marcus, barely 17 years old, standing in the marble corridors of the Palatine Palace in the year 39 after Christ. Your sandaled feet echo against cold stone as imperial guards with bronze armor escort you deeper into the palace complex. The torches flicker against frescoed walls depicting scenes that make your stomach turn. You were summoned here for what your father believed was an honor, a private audience with Emperor Caligula himself. But the servants who prepared you this morning whispered warnings that made your hands shake. They spoke of chambers beneath the palace where screams echoed through marble halls, where young nobles entered and never emerged the same. As heavy bronze doors swing open before you, revealing corridors that descend into darkness, you realize you're about to discover why Rome's most powerful families send their sons to serve the emperor, and why so few ever speak of what happens in those hidden chambers. What you don't know yet is that you're entering the most depraved imperial complex in human history, where a 27-year-old emperor has transformed the seat of Roman power into his personal playground of systematic horror. The chambers ahead contain innovations in cruelty that would make medieval torture masters seem like children playing with toys. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. Everything you're about to witness was legal, documented, and considered normal entertainment for the most powerful man in the world. Think ancient Rome was all gladiator fights and political intrigue? The reality hidden in Caligula's private chambers makes those public spectacles look like gentle entertainment. For 4 years, from 37 to 41 after Christ, the Roman Empire was ruled by a madman who turned imperial power into a systematic engine of horror that targeted the most vulnerable people in his domain. What happened in those secret chambers wasn't just personal depravity, it was state-sponsored terror that reached into every corner of Roman society. The young Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, inherited an empire and unlimited power at age 24. What he created with that power reveals the darkest possibilities of human nature when every restraint is removed. The chambers beneath the Palatine weren't just rooms for private entertainment. They were laboratories for testing the limits of human degradation, staffed by professionals who specialized in keeping victims alive through experiences that should have killed them. The palace complex that Caligula inherited was already vast, covering several acres of Rome's Palatine Hill. But within months of taking power, the young emperor began construction projects that baffled architects and horrified workers. The official records speak of expanding imperial entertainment facilities. The reality was far more sinister. Caligula ordered the construction of a network of underground chambers connected to the main palace by tunnels. These weren't simple basement rooms. They were sophisticated facilities with specific purposes. The main complex included holding chambers for victims, preparation rooms where they were readied for what awaited them, specialized chambers equipped with devices whose purpose becomes clear from survivor testimony, medical facilities staffed by physicians whose job was to keep victims alive through extended ordeals, and disposal areas for dealing with those who didn't survive. The construction employed the finest craftsmen in the empire, but with a twist that reveals Caligula's methodical madness. Workers were divided into small teams, each responsible for only one aspect of the project. Stone masons carved chambers without knowing their purpose. Metal workers forged devices without understanding their function. Only Caligula and his closest collaborators knew the true nature of what was being built. The emperor personally supervised every detail, making modifications that improved the functionality of spaces designed for horror. Soundproofing was installed using theater construction techniques, ensuring that screams couldn't reach the palace above. Drainage systems were engineered to handle large volumes of blood. Ventilation systems provided fresh air while channeling smoke and odors away from the main palace. Lighting was carefully planned to create psychological effects, with some chambers kept in perpetual darkness while others were lit by hundreds of oil lamps that created an atmosphere of hellish illumination. The recruitment process for staffing these chambers demonstrates how Caligula corrupted every aspect of Roman society to serve his appetites. He couldn't simply rely on slaves and servants. The scope of his operations required skilled professionals. The emperor created new positions within the imperial household that appeared legitimate but served dark purposes. Imperial physicians were recruited with promises of advancement and access to unique medical research opportunities. Only after accepting their positions did they discover their real responsibilities: keeping victims alive during prolonged ordeals, developing techniques to maximize pain while preventing death, treating injuries in ways that ensured victims could survive repeated sessions. Caligula also recruited specialists from across the empire, former gladiator trainers who understood how to inflict maximum damage while keeping opponents functional, executioners from various provinces who had developed expertise in prolonging death, artisans who specialized in creating devices for restraint and torture. The emperor's recruitment methods were sophisticated and manipulative, gradually introducing individuals to increasingly dark activities until they were completely compromised. The scale of the operation required a complex hierarchy. At the top were the emperor's personal attendants who helped plan activities. Below them were chamber supervisors, specialist technicians, medical staff, security personnel, and cleaning crews. This wasn't a handful of sadistic individuals. It was a professional organization with hundreds of employees working together to facilitate systematic brutalization on an industrial scale. The victim selection process reveals the calculated nature of Caligula's terror campaign. He systematically targeted specific groups for specific purposes. Young nobles from prominent families were the primary targets, serving multiple purposes in his scheme. These victims came from the social class that traditionally provided political opposition to imperial power. By victimizing their children, the emperor broke the will of potential rivals, while demonstrating that no one was beyond his reach. The sons and daughters of senators, wealthy merchants, and military commanders were summoned to the palace under various pretexts: educational opportunities, ceremonial roles, or administrative positions. Once in the palace, these young people discovered that their expected honors were actually death sentences or worse. The emperor would often allow parents to believe their children were being given opportunities at court, only revealing the truth when it was too late for rescue. Caligula also targeted groups based on their perceived attractiveness or unique characteristics. Twins were particularly sought after for experiments that involved simultaneous torture. Individuals with unusual physical features were collected like exotic specimens. Athletes and performers were chosen for their physical conditioning, which allowed them to survive longer ordeals. The emperor's agents operated throughout the empire, posing as talent scouts or education officers, using official imperial credentials to gain access to families. Parents were told their children had been selected for prestigious positions, never suspecting they were actually condemning them to horror beyond imagination. Foreign slaves and captives provided another category of victims, chosen specifically because their disappearance would attract less attention. Prisoners of war were diverted to the palace chambers instead of being sold in slave markets. These victims had no families in Rome to search for them, and no legal protections that might complicate their use. The preparation process for victims reveals the methodical horror of Caligula's operations. Before entering the emperor's chambers, victims underwent elaborate procedures designed to maximize their psychological vulnerability. Newly arrived victims were held in comfortable quarters for several days, creating false hope. They were provided with excellent food and fine clothing, while servants gathered information about their fears and psychological vulnerabilities. During this preparation period, victims were gradually introduced to disturbing information about their situation. They might overhear conversations about previous victims or observe cleaning crews carrying suspicious materials. This psychological conditioning was designed to create maximum anxiety before victims ever encountered the emperor directly. Medical examinations were conducted under the pretense of ensuring victim health, but actually served to identify physical limitations that would influence how they were used. Physicians would test pain tolerance and assess physical conditioning. All of this information was recorded in detailed files that helped determine the most effective approaches for each individual. The most disturbing aspect was the false hope procedure, where victims were told they had been selected for legitimate positions within the imperial household. They received training for their supposed new roles, complete with uniforms. This deception continued until the moment they were delivered to the chambers, maximizing the psychological shock of discovering their true fate. The final stage involved drugging victims with substances that enhanced their awareness while reducing their ability to resist effectively. These drugs created a state of heightened sensitivity while preventing loss of consciousness that might provide escape from their ordeal. Throughout this entire process, victims remained unaware of their true fate until they were delivered to Caligula's chambers. Now that you've witnessed the systematic preparation and architectural horror of Caligula's underground complex, you're beginning to see the patterns hidden in history's shadows. If uncovering these buried truths resonates with your curiosity about the real human experience, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most guarded secrets. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about the depths human beings can sink to when power removes all moral constraints. The chamber layout reveals the architectural genius applied to creating the perfect environment for systematic horror. The entrance chambers were designed to create immediate psychological impact through overwhelming sensory experiences. Victims descending from the palace would first encounter rooms lined with marble, featuring disturbing imagery that appeared decorative but actually depicted scenes of torture and death. The lighting was carefully controlled to create moving shadows, while hidden mechanisms produced whispers and screams that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Holding chambers were designed as luxurious prisons where victims waited while watching and hearing evidence of what happened to others. These rooms featured comfortable furnishings but walls thin enough to transmit sounds from nearby chambers. Victims could hear screams and mechanical sounds of devices in operation, creating anticipatory terror that was often worse than actual torture. Specialized activity chambers were designed around specific themes that reflected Caligula's various interests. Some chambers recreated mythological scenes with elaborate sets and props that allowed the emperor to force victims to participate in twisted reenactments. Others were designed for group activities, with space and equipment that allowed multiple victims to be tortured simultaneously or forced to participate in each other's suffering. Medical chambers were staffed with physicians and equipped with sophisticated equipment designed to keep victims alive and conscious through experiences that should have killed them. These rooms contained surgical instruments, drugs, and monitoring equipment that allowed medical staff to intervene when victims approached death, reviving them for continued torture. Recovery chambers were perhaps the most psychologically devastating spaces. These rooms appeared as luxurious medical facilities where victims were cared for after their ordeals. The contrast between the care they received and the horror they had experienced created additional psychological trauma that often proved more devastating than the original torture. The devices and techniques employed represent innovations in systematic torture that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and psychology. These weren't crude instruments, but precisely engineered tools designed to maximize suffering while preventing death. The restraint systems utilized principles of leverage and anatomy that allowed complete immobilization while maintaining circulation. Bronze and iron devices were custom forged to specific measurements, ensuring perfect fit that prevented escape while maintaining victim viability. Suspension devices utilized pulley systems that allowed victims to be positioned in ways that maximized vulnerability while distributing weight to prevent fatal injury. The hydraulic systems represented cutting-edge engineering applied to horrific purposes. Water torture devices utilized controlled pressure and temperature to create sensations of drowning or scalding without causing fatal damage. Chemical torture techniques utilized various plants and minerals that created specific types of pain without destroying tissue beyond repair. The emperor's personal favorite devices were those that forced victims to participate in their own torture or the torture of others. Mechanisms required victims to maintain specific positions to prevent worse punishment for themselves or other victims. These devices created psychological torture that accompanied physical pain, forcing victims to choose between different types of suffering. The psychological techniques employed alongside physical torture demonstrate Caligula's sophisticated understanding of human nature. These methods were designed not just to cause immediate suffering, but to permanently destroy victims' capacity for normal human relationships and psychological function. The most effective psychological torture involved forcing victims to make impossible choices between different types of suffering for themselves or others. Victims might be forced to choose which family member would be tortured, or required to torture others to reduce their own suffering. These choices created guilt and psychological trauma that persisted long after physical wounds healed. Identity destruction techniques involved systematically attacking everything that defined victims as human beings. Their names were replaced with numbers or degrading titles. Their personal histories were denied and replaced with false narratives. Their relationships with family and friends were poisoned through forced testimony that made reconciliation impossible. The daily operations within the chamber complex followed carefully planned schedules that maximized efficiency while ensuring the emperor's personal satisfaction. Morning preparations began before dawn, with medical staff examining victims to determine their readiness for activities planned for that day. The emperor's daily schedule was planned weeks in advance, with specific victims assigned to particular activities based on his current interests. Administrative procedures included detailed record-keeping that documented every aspect of chamber operations. Scribes maintained logs of victim intake, medical treatment, torture sessions, and disposal of those who died. Equipment maintenance required skilled technicians who ensured that devices remained in optimal condition. Supply chains provided everything needed for sustained operations while maintaining operational security. The victim experience within Caligula's chambers represents the ultimate expression of human evil applied with systematic precision. The initial shock of discovering their true situation was carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological impact. Victims who had been told they were receiving honors suddenly found themselves stripped, chained, and facing instruments of torture while the emperor explained in detail what was going to happen to them. Physical torture was applied gradually, beginning with techniques that caused intense pain without serious injury, and escalating to methods that pushed victims to the edge of death. The progression was carefully controlled to maximize suffering without causing immediate death, allowing sessions to continue for hours, days, or even weeks. Psychological torture accompanied every physical technique, with specialists using detailed knowledge of victim backgrounds to attack their deepest fears and most cherished relationships. Family members were threatened, religious beliefs were mocked, personal achievements were degraded, and hopes for the future were systematically destroyed. Forced participation in the torture of others was one of the most devastating techniques. Victims were required to inflict torture on family members or friends, creating guilt that persisted long after physical wounds healed. Those who refused faced escalated torture for themselves and the people they were trying to protect. Medical intervention was used not to provide relief, but to prolong suffering by preventing death or unconsciousness. Physicians administered drugs that maintained consciousness, treated injuries just enough to prevent fatal complications, and monitored vital signs to ensure that torture continued at optimal levels. Recovery periods between sessions were designed to provide false hope while actually increasing psychological pressure. Victims were moved to comfortable chambers where they received medical treatment and good food. This apparent kindness made the return to torture even more devastating and prevented victims from adapting psychologically to constant abuse. Long-term survivors described a complete transformation of their understanding of human nature and their own capacity for endurance. Many reported that the experience destroyed their ability to trust other people, form normal relationships, or find meaning in activities that had previously brought them joy. The political implications of chamber operations extended far beyond immediate victims to encompass the entire structure of Roman society. The targeting of senatorial families served multiple political purposes. By victimizing the children of potential political rivals, Caligula prevented the formation of opposition coalitions while demonstrating that no one was beyond his reach. The emperor's treatment of military families sent clear messages to army commanders about the consequences of disloyalty. Officers who might have considered rebellion were forced to weigh their political ambitions against the safety of their children. Economic elites faced similar pressures as their children were selected for chamber activities that demonstrated the emperor's power over commercial classes. The psychological impact on Roman society created a climate of fear and submission that extended far beyond immediate victims and their families. Everyone understood that expressing dissent could result in themselves or their loved ones being summoned to the palace for activities that no one discussed openly, but everyone feared desperately. The corruption of Roman institutions through chamber operations demonstrated how quickly civilized society can collapse when power is concentrated without moral constraints. The legal system, military command structure, religious institutions, and economic networks all became tools for identifying and delivering victims to satisfy the emperor's appetites. The resistance and eventual downfall of Caligula's regime was directly connected to the chamber operations that had been designed to prevent such opposition. The systematic victimization of noble families eventually created a coalition of enemies who had nothing left to lose. The Praetorian Guard, whose members had been forced to participate in chamber operations, eventually turned against the emperor they had been sworn to defend. The conspiracy that ultimately killed Caligula involved multiple layers of Roman society united by their shared trauma and desire for revenge. Cassius Chaerea, the Praetorian tribune who led the assassination, had personally escorted dozens of young victims to the chambers and witnessed their destruction at the emperor's hands. His transformation from loyal guardian to assassin demonstrates how the chamber operations ultimately corrupted the very institutions designed to protect imperial power. The planning for the assassination required detailed knowledge of palace security, chamber locations, and the emperor's daily routines that only insiders could provide. Guards who had witnessed chamber activities provided intelligence about Caligula's movements between his public audiences and private entertainment. Palace servants who had cleaned the chambers after torture sessions offered information about hidden passages and escape routes. Medical staff who had treated victims shared knowledge about the emperor's psychological state and his increasing paranoia. The timing of the assassination was deliberately chosen to coincide with the Palatine Games, when the emperor's attention would be focused on public entertainment rather than chamber activities. The conspirators knew that Caligula would use the underground passages to move between the theater and his private chambers, providing an opportunity to intercept him away from his most loyal supporters and in corridors where his screams would be, muffled by the same soundproofing that had hidden victim cries. The actual assassination revealed the depth of hatred that chamber operations had created among those forced to participate. Multiple conspirators struck simultaneously, ensuring that the emperor would die quickly rather than face the prolonged suffering he had inflicted on so many others. The violence of his death reflected years of accumulated rage from guards, servants, and officials who had been forced to facilitate systematic torture while maintaining the appearance of loyalty. The immediate aftermath of the assassination included a systematic purge of chamber staff and the destruction of evidence that might implicate the new imperial administration in the previous regime's activities. Physicians who had served in the chambers were quietly executed or exiled to prevent their knowledge from surfacing in future political conflicts. Guards who had witnessed chamber operations were transferred to distant provinces where their testimony could not threaten imperial legitimacy. The cover-up operation that followed Caligula's death was as sophisticated as the chamber operations themselves, involving coordination between military commanders, Senate leaders, and palace administrators who understood that the full truth about chamber activities could destabilize the entire imperial system. Records were systematically destroyed, physical evidence was removed, and witnesses were eliminated or silenced through threats and bribes. You came into this story thinking ancient Rome was about military conquest and political intrigue, and now you leave understanding that unlimited power in the hands of a person without moral constraints can create horrors that exceed the worst imaginings of human depravity. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey of discovery has awakened your appetite for truth, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations that textbooks won't teach. Your curiosity about the real human experience deserves to be fed with the unvarnished reality of how power actually operates when all restraints are removed. The legacy of Caligula's chamber operations extends far beyond immediate victims to influence torture techniques, political control methods, and systematic oppression throughout subsequent history. The innovations in psychological manipulation, physical torture, and administrative organization developed in those underground chambers became templates for later regimes that sought to control populations through terror. The medical techniques for prolonging victim survival during torture were preserved and transmitted through networks of physicians who had served in the chambers. These methods later appeared throughout history, from medieval torture chambers to modern interrogation facilities, demonstrating the persistent influence of knowledge gained through systematic brutalization. The psychological techniques for breaking human resistance became foundational methods for later torture operations. The systematic approach to destroying human identity, corrupting moral principles, and creating lasting psychological damage was codified in training manuals that influenced torture specialists for centuries. Archaeological evidence discovered in the ruins of the Palatine Palace continues to reveal new information about the scope and sophistication of chamber operations. Excavations have uncovered sophisticated drainage systems designed for handling large volumes of blood. Mechanical devices whose purpose becomes clear only when compared to historical accounts, and architectural features that served specific functions in facilitating systematic torture. The discovery of personal items belonging to victims, preserved in sealed chambers for nearly 2,000 years, provides tangible connections to the human cost of chamber operations. Jewelry, clothing fragments, and personal possessions found in excavations represent individual lives destroyed by systematic evil, offering physical evidence that validates historical accounts about the scope and nature of chamber activities. The young senator's son Marcus, whose perspective opened this journey into horror, represents all innocent victims whose lives were destroyed by systematic evil operating under legal authority. According to family records discovered centuries later, Marcus spent 3 months in the chamber complex before being released as part of a political negotiation. His survival came at the cost of his family's complete submission to imperial authority. Marcus wrote extensively about the sounds that haunted him for decades after his release: the grinding of bronze gears in torture devices, the splash of water in the hydraulic systems, the whispered prayers of victims in holding chambers. He described the smell of fear that permeated the underground complex, a mixture of sweat, blood, and the herbs used to drug victims into compliance. Most disturbing were his accounts of the emperor's personal involvement in every session, how Caligula would study victim responses with the detached curiosity of a natural philosopher conducting experiments. The survival techniques that Marcus developed during his 3 months in the chambers reveal the psychological adaptations necessary to endure systematic torture. He learned to dissociate his mind from his body during physical torture, creating mental refuges where consciousness could retreat while his physical form endured unimaginable suffering. He developed elaborate memory exercises that allowed him to preserve his identity even as specialists worked to destroy his sense of self through degradation and false narratives. His family's political submission to Caligula involved providing detailed intelligence about other senatorial families, their wealth, their children, and their potential for opposition to imperial authority. Marcus's father was forced to identify which of his colleagues had young children suitable for chamber activities, effectively becoming a recruiting agent for the emperor's systematic victimization program. This collaboration haunted the family for generations, creating guilt and shame that poisoned relationships with other noble families who discovered their role in facilitating further atrocities. The medical records that physicians maintained on Marcus during his captivity provide clinical insights into the physical and psychological effects of prolonged torture on young victims. These documents, discovered in sealed archives during archaeological excavations, describe in clinical language the techniques used to monitor victim health while maintaining optimal levels of suffering. They reveal the sophisticated understanding of human physiology that allowed chamber specialists to keep victims alive and conscious through experiences that should have resulted in death or permanent unconsciousness. The negotiation that secured Marcus's release involved his family's agreement to provide ongoing intelligence about potential opposition to Caligula's rule, effectively making them permanent agents of the imperial terror apparatus. They were required to attend court functions where they observed other families being targeted for chamber activities, forced to maintain the appearance of loyalty while witnessing the selection of victims they were powerless to protect. This psychological torture of complicity extended the chamber's reach beyond its physical boundaries, creating networks of traumatized collaborators throughout Roman society. The documentation that Marcus preserved about chamber operations includes detailed descriptions of specific torture techniques, victim preparation procedures, and the administrative systems that manage the complex. His accounts describe the bureaucratic efficiency with which human suffering was organized and administered, revealing how easily civilized institutions can be corrupted to serve evil purposes when moral constraints are abandoned. His religious contemplations in later life focused on theological questions about the nature of evil and the existence of divine justice, in a world where such systematic horror could operate with imperial sanction. He corresponded with Christian theologians and Stoic philosophers, seeking intellectual frameworks that could help him understand his experiences and find meaning in survival when so many others had perished. These letters, preserved in monastery archives, provide insights into the long-term psychological effects of surviving systematic torture and the spiritual challenges faced by those who witnessed ultimate human evil. The physical effects of chamber torture followed Marcus throughout his life, creating chronic pain and medical conditions that required ongoing treatment. Roman physicians who examined him years after his release documented injuries that revealed the sophisticated torture techniques employed in the chambers. Bone fractures that had been deliberately inflicted and then carefully treated to ensure survival, nerve damage from precise application of pressure and heat, and psychological symptoms that manifested as physical ailments requiring medical intervention. His reluctance to discuss his experiences created family tensions that persisted for generations, as relatives struggled to understand his transformation from a vibrant young man into a withdrawn religious contemplative. The silence that survivors maintained about chamber activities was itself a form of ongoing psychological torture, preventing them from processing their trauma through normal social support systems while forcing them to carry their burden of knowledge in isolation. The transformation in Roman social dynamics caused by chamber operations affected how noble families interacted with each other and with imperial authority. Marcus's family found themselves isolated from former allies who suspected their collaboration with Caligula's regime, while simultaneously being viewed with suspicion by imperial authorities who questioned their loyalty despite their enforced cooperation. This social isolation was deliberately created by the emperor's program, ensuring that potential opponents remained divided and unable to form effective coalitions against his rule. The chambers beneath the Palatine Palace stand as monuments to the darkest possibilities of human nature and the importance of institutional constraints on individual power. They remind us that civilization is a fragile construction that can collapse quickly when power is concentrated in the hands of individuals without moral principles or institutional oversight. The emperor, who believed himself a god, learned too late that even absolute power cannot protect those who confuse cruelty with strength and systematic torture with effective governance. His death at the hands of his own guards served as justice not only for his specific crimes, but for the greater crime of treating human beings as disposable objects in service of personal appetites and political ambition. The 4 years of Caligula's reign represent one of the darkest chapters in human history, not because of the scale of killing, but because of the systematic application of sophisticated knowledge and unlimited resources to maximizing human suffering for the personal satisfaction of a single individual. His legacy serves as an eternal warning about the dangers of absolute power and the importance of maintaining institutional safeguards that prevent the concentration of authority in the hands of individuals who lack the moral principles necessary to exercise power responsibly. The victims who suffered in his chambers deserve to be remembered as individual human beings, whose pain serves as testimony to the importance of protecting human dignity and maintaining the moral constraints that separate civilization from barbarism.